This year has been an interesting one to say the least. Real-life problems seem to be pouring out of every orifice of real life. Free speech concerns, nuclear threats, and Nutella heists. No, seriously, who steals that much Nutella? Everyone seems to be at each other's throats regardless, and it's sort of depressing when you really think about it. However, there seems to be one shining bright spot from my side this year, and that's the games that I've played. Don't get me wrong, gaming itself has a lot of problems right now. Microtransactions seem to be ramping up to ridiculous levels, publishers are refusing to answer simple and basic questions, and Steam Direct seems to be dumping more crap on the Steam store than you find at a dog park. But despite that, this year has been an onslaught of great titles, to the point where I can't even keep up with them. I haven't even gotten the chance to play games like Tekken 7, Horizon Zero Dawn, or hell, Breath of the Wild that much. Many of those titles have been from the big hitters in the industry: Platinum Games, Guerrilla Games, Atlas, etc., etc. Which means indie titles may have to take a back seat this year. Except on this channel, of course, because it's my job to highlight those hidden gems that you may have overlooked. And even though everyone who's played it will tell you the same thing, I'm here to echo the opinions of my colleagues, as a small title named Hollow Knight deserves a spot among the kings this year. Hollow Knight is developed by Team Cherry and costs $14.99. It's available on Steam, GOG, and the Humble Bundle store, and came out on February 24th, 2017. I know, I'm a little late to this party, but this was a game voted on by subscribers for me to review, so I have to oblige. The game falls into the Metroidvania genre, one of my favorite genres, which seems to have gotten a bit of a resurgence this year, with titles like Blaster Master Zero already released, and titles like Metroid Samus Returns still to come out. So here's the question: what does Hollow Knight do to stand out, and why is it worth your time? Why should you give this smaller indie a chance against the bigger juggernauts that have come out this year? Well, if you stick around, you're about to find out. Normally, I start with a game story in these reviews, but this time around, let's do something a bit different. The meat of Hollow Knight resides in its gameplay, so let's start there instead. The game follows in the footsteps of Metroidvania games of the past, most specifically the Castlevania series. Fittingly, the game's basic formula is as follows. You'll need to explore the map to find the next area that you'll need to tackle, usually now accessible thanks to a new ability that you have gotten. You'll have to fight your way through a series of monsters and navigate through a maze of traps and hazards in this new area. At the end of the area, there's of course a boss to test your skills, and then the formula resets. For the most part anyway. The game does give you some slight freedom to explore at certain points, or to choose among a couple of different paths during your playthrough. To do that, you'll need to master the game's movement and controls, and this is where you can start to see the brilliance of Team Cherry's game design. At the core of Hollow Knight is a system that rewards precision in a variety of different ways. For example, the game will force you into claustrophobic cave clusters, having you dash from wall to wall, avoiding spikes that would make Mega Man cower in fear. Then, the game will have you use your sword to jump across an acid pit, using an armored enemy as a moving platform. Now, what I love about this control system is how it punishes missteps, and actually follows some interesting rules regarding physics. If you attempt to jump onto a platform with an enemy on the edge, you might find yourself in a pit very quickly. The reason being is simple. Enemies actually will resist you at times, and it may push you back when striking an enemy, especially those that are armored. In the early game, I found myself falling into pits a bunch because of this, but I learned, I got a little bit better, and then understood that hey, maybe I can do something a little bit different, or come from the top and use a sword jump. Funny thing is, the game never tells you that you can sword jump, at least not that I saw, but the game put me into a situation where I discovered it naturally, and usually that's a good sign of a well-designed game. Movement must be purposeful in Hollow Knight, because each movement puts you in the spot where you can start dealing damage, or avoiding it. And unlike other games in the genre, this game is far from many of the modern action Metroidvanias. In fact, it's more like one of the core original Metroidvanias, Castlevania. The reason being is, like that original Castlevania, you got a little bit of a delay after your weapon strike. In the original Castlevania, it was your whip. In this game, it's your nail, aka sword. The delay here is a bit different, however, because it's more about the delay that happens after you swing, not the swing startup. With swinging your sword, you take a little bit of time to recover, and you slow down a bit and can't move as fast. Now, considering the range of your sword and where you need to be to hit an enemy, that could mean you're in a danger area of being hit by them, which is the give and take of this combat system, and where the precision comes into play. The more precise with precision you are, the better combat will go. If I'm able to constantly hit at the tip of my sword, that's an area where I'm usually safe, and I'm probably going to be tearing enemies apart and not taking damage. But if it's near the trunk of the sword, you're probably gonna take damage if you miss with your strike, so you better hit it. The combat in Hollow Knight, in particular with the swordplay, reminds me a lot of a fencing match. And yes, I know I've used that analogy before, but it's apt here. If I go and rush in and don't really think about what I'm doing and just sort of hack away, I'm gonna get punished. But if I'm precise, if I move in at the right time, I'm going to win almost every battle, and there's something about this game that makes it feel really, really good. See, that's the thing I love about Hollow Knight. Every time that I took damage, I didn't complain. I didn't start yelling that the game wasn't fair. I didn't even question it. I knew that I was the one that made the massive mistake. That's all due to how the Hollow Knight team designed their combat to be simple, straightforward, and yet easy to follow with a precise system. After beating the game and doing some research, one of the big complaints I see from other people is that the game is too simple, that there isn't a lot of abilities or weapons that you'd see in other Metroidvanias. And sure, the combat may be considered basic by some people, as you only have your nail sword, along with one ranged ability to fight with. There's no combos of any sort, there's no secondary weapons. In fact, the only customization of your fights comes in the charms that you can equip, which may give your nail a bit more range, or allow you to recover your health a bit faster. But what the combat relies on to succeed is simple. Enemy patterns that have distinct escape areas that you have to deal with, or timing windows that are pretty constrained. You jump at the wrong time, you'll get hit. You mispredict where the enemy is about to go, you're gonna get hit. Certain charms may help widen the reaction gap in certain cases, but it all comes down to the simplest of actions, where you are and when you attack. In addition, every system in Hollow Knight is purposeful in its execution, and makes for a much better game because of it. Take the health system, for example. There are no traditional health drops in Hollow Knight. There are two major ways to restore your health, however: using the save system to heal at a bench, of course, or to use an early game ability that uses energy you gather from enemies as you hit them. Now, the ability to heal at any time with energy you can replenish seems pretty damn useful, and it'd make the game's challenge rather easy. Except for one tiny itsy bitsy thing: the time it takes to gain back your health while using it. So if you use it at the wrong time, an enemy can just waltz right up to you and take away that health that you just gained. Or hell, he may be able to get 2 shots in because you weren't moving at the time, even with the periods of invincibility that happen when you get hit. So why does this mechanic work so well? Well, the brilliance here is in the timing. If you time it right based on boss patterns, for example, you can get that health regain in and not take damage. But you have to be really precise with the timing and positioning. In fact, you'll probably need to know the pattern to really do it against some of the harder bosses. If you do it at the wrong time, You've wasted a bunch of energy that you could have used on ranged attacks at that point, and those ranged attacks can be pretty strong. The game also paces itself rather nicely in terms of combat, not reusing enemies that often, but when it does so smartly, being reasonably far from when you first encountered them. Each enemy has a unique movement pattern or distinct attack style, meaning that you're not just getting buffed up versions of basic ground soldiers. You're getting enemies that you'll have to react to differently, and in different configurations battle-wise. In addition, I cannot stress how much the level design plays into the battles here. And with that said, I'm going to actually say something pretty controversial here. This may be the best designed Metroidvania map that I have played when it comes to different combat scenarios ever. Yes, ever. I've played Symphony of the Night, I've played Super Metroid, and I don't make that statement lightly. It's the way they've used different curves and areas to affect the battles while understanding the enemy AI and how it would react to that. Let me show you an example with these flying bugs here. Now, this area is pretty open, and I have a lot of room to work with in terms of finding a way to damage these guys. You'll see that the enemy doesn't necessarily charge right into me all the time, but it will occasionally do so. However, in every case, it does accordingly react to my movement and chase me when appropriate. It's a good introduction to this enemy, and I have to realize how to dodge its attacks and lure it into scenarios that are beneficial to me. But then those same enemies end up in this tower, and things completely change. Because of the way they end up flying, and where they are in conjunction to the elevator, I don't have the same attack vectors as I did before. Luring them into a positive scenario for me is hard at first because, well, I'm used to the open areas and now I have walls. I don't have as much room to work with. And so I've got to make a decision. Do I bait the attack and hopefully get to the other side of him, having a little bit more room to work with? Or do I stay my ground and find a new way to take them out? All of these elements in terms of the game design leads to one thing, that I was never bored with combat. It was too fresh, even towards the end game when I was looking for items and trying to work towards the true ending. For a game that was 10 plus hours, at least based off a little of an estimation, because I recorded about 25 hours of gameplay and a lot of it was a little bit paused. That's still pretty darn good in terms of 10 plus hours of gameplay. Now, I have sorta overlooked the exploration part of the Metroidvania genre here, and to be fair, it's a good implementation, although I can see it being very off-putting for some people. That has to do with two things, not necessarily knowing what part is next, and the map system, but more on that in a little bit. The actual traversal of the map with your abilities is really fun, especially when you realize how they designed the maps here. This isn't a coddled version of the genre, aka the level design is not designed in a way that will stop you from dropping down into an acid pit if you're recklessly moving forward. You've got to be slower and precise at certain points, and I really appreciate that. But unlike other games in the genre that may have that kind of same level design but are a little bit worse in this implementation, this game gives you the tools to actually be able to predict, hey, guess what, that's going to be an acid pit down there. You can tell via like waterfalls, drops of water, and the way things move, as well as the ability to actually look down. But back to the map thing. This game isn't like some others in the early game when it comes to your objectives. You get to a new area, you really don't know what room you need to get to specifically, or where the upgrade in the area is. You'll have to find it yourself, and sometimes you will be blocked from progressing in that one area due to not having the particular skill in question, and you'll have to backtrack. Which to me is fine, especially thanks to the free DLC now having a fast travel system. If it wasn't there, that would have been a huge complaint. And before you ask, yes, backtracking is a part of Metroidvanias, but the thing is, this type of backtracking in terms of not having that objective marker would have been very, very tedious. The thing to note also is that you'll need to find the map maker in an area in order to see what the area looks like to begin with, and if you don't happen to find him by chance, the level is going to be a bit harder to get through, just because you may not remember where you've gone and where you need to go. For the Metroidvania genre, the games usually force you into this map area to begin with, unless if it's an optional area, at least in my experience. You sorta have to go out of your way to miss it. That isn't the case in this game, and I'm not really sure how I feel about that. There were 1 or 2 sections that I beat that I did not get the map for until I beat the boss, and those were the sections that took the longest. And to be frank, I have to call out the developer on one thing. The map maker makes a distinct cry when you're in the room that he's in, so you know that, hey, the map maker's in this room. The thing with this room, however, is that he's behind this barrier, which you really can't reach until later in the game. I spent a bunch of time trying to figure out how to get rid of this barrier and find this map maker, only to realize later on that, hey, guess what? I couldn't have reached him. To be frank, this is sort of a dick move, even though I slightly understand its purpose in the gameplay and what it was trying to teach. Still a dick move. I only have one other general complaint when it comes to the gameplay. There are times in the game where the challenge just doesn't meet up to the standards within the rest of it. Specifically, there's one boss in particular that has a pretty big hole in his AI that can be exploited that sort of disappointed me. There were 2 other bosses where I say the challenge needed to be ramped up a tiny bit more to keep with a level playing field with the other bosses, but this one I didn't break a sweat, even though it was supposed to be one of the harder bosses in the game, at least based on the fact that it was sort of an optional boss. Overall, the gameplay for me was one of the best combat systems I've played this year, and frankly makes the game worth the purchase by itself. To be frank, it feels sort of like the genre evolved with this game. And you know what? I have to commend the design work that went into this. Well done, Team Cherry. Well frickin' done. I'll take a second to briefly talk about the technical elements of Hollow Knight as well. The game runs at 60 FPS, which is a good sign right from the get-go. What's also great here is that the frame rate for the most part is really stable. Now, rarely a game would hiccup once or twice during an hour-long play session, but that's if I noticed that hiccup. In fact, the only time I consistently noticed the hiccup was a frame rate drop during this one particular cutscene. And I'm not sure if that isn't just me and my eyes playing tricks on me. For the PC portion of this, the game has controller support of the major types, and while the keyboard controls are definitely usable, I just prefer the feel of a controller in my hands when it comes to playing a Metroidvania. With that said, the game does strongly recommend a controller as well, and I have to agree with it after trying both of them out. It's just due to how naturally the swordplay comes along with the analog sticks, and the combat system rewarding precision, which is actually easier to get with the analog sticks in my mind rather than the keyboard and mouse. Unlike other games of the genre, however, I don't think you're at a huge disadvantage if you only have the keyboard and mouse controls here. The fact is, the game's definitely playable. As for options, they're okay from an indie game. You got language choices, you got the ability to show achievements, which I do appreciate because, hey, guess what? Sometimes that little pop-up really gets frickin' annoying. And you've got standard audio sliders for master volume, sound, and music. As for video options, they're sorta limited. You got a couple of resolution choices, your standard full screen, your VSync, and you can turn particle effects to low in case, the game is giving you problems, although it really shouldn't. You can adjust the screen, you can adjust the brightness, but honestly, compared to other games in the genre, this is on the lower side of available options, but not bad. As for the keyboard controls, you have full rebindable keys here. Now, the controller, on the other hand, is a little bit different. You can do things like the jump, attack, dash, and so on and so forth in terms of binding those controls, but when it comes to up, left, down, and right, and the pause button, no, you can't. Next, I have to talk about Hollow Knight's presentation. It's very easy to look at the overall style that the developers had gone for here and be impressed with what you're seeing on the surface. But it's when you start peeling the layers of the visual presentation back that you really see how impressive this game truly is. Almost all of the game's environments use a simplified color scheme, focusing on various whites, grays, blacks, and one primary color for the background. This creates a very interesting style, as it's always easy to see where your character is on any point of the screen, but overshadows some of the ridiculous detail that the game has in its environments. The game uses various blur and grain effects to focus on the action and the characters, and this ends up giving a sharpness to the enemies and your knight while they go at each other in combat. But man, that's just the tip of the iceberg here. There's a lot of little detail that the game really enhances the presentation in both the foreground and the background. You'd only really notice it if you're watching footage like I have been for the last couple of hours. Just look what's going on in the background here. The glow of the lights, the rain falling on the window's side, the raindrop that occurs every so often in the immediate foreground. Every area has this kind of little touch that makes it unique and makes you want to find those little details within this world. As for the character and monster designs themselves, they may be based on bugs in a lot of cases, but the simplistic design of each character, along with the animation style here, really works. I can't stress this enough. They may be drawings on a screen, but something felt natural about how these characters move given how they looked. It reminds me a lot of Binding of Isaac, in fact, in several ways, but taken up to the next degree, especially with creature facial expressions and movement patterns. Now, I'll mention this in the story section as well, but one of the fantastic things about this presentation is how well it's able to articulate the character traits of the enemy and breathe story into them. Look, I always say that two of the things I see in some of the best games I play are as follows: that the devil is always in the details, and that all the elements work together in harmony, complementing each other perfectly. The way that enemies are presented here are a perfect example of that. Take these knights for example. You may look at them and be like, Dragnix, they're just some knight enemies in the game. They fit the theme of the game, they look cool, but they don't tell a specific story or make sense more than anything else in the game just by how they look. What the hell are you talking about? And I'd tell you you'd be wrong. First, obviously they are large and round bugs, and throw those shuriken-like devices to try to hit their enemy. And I can tell you why that bug decided to do that in the way he's animated. Don't believe me? Well, watch. Notice how the creature goes to throw the device, it arches its back. Strange, don't you think? Why arc it like that when you could just throw it straight at me? Okay, sure, enemy patterns and whatnot, but you'll also notice something else within this fight. Never does the bug really ever bend his back more than a 15-degree or so angle. It's almost like he's got a rigid exoskeleton. Oh, wait a minute. That could explain why he fights like that. Unlike other sword enemies, he can't reach down and hit things smaller than him, or reach up and hit things bigger than him if he was using a sword. So in order to hit enemies that weren't directly in front of him, he needed a weapon that made sense given his build, and specifically his arm length. This kind of storytelling is the next level, and sure, I may be completely pulling things out of my ass in this case, but the thing is, that's the story it told me with this one character, and there's 30, 40, 50 different enemies, 50 different characters that have these unique attributes that help in the presentation and the story. And I love every single little detail that they've added to the game here. And with all the fancy schmancy analysis out of the way, It just looks cool. I mean, this is what drew me to the game. Okay, it was a Metroidvania. Yeah, I love Metroidvanias. I was gonna probably look at the game. But the reason why I looked at this one was the art style. And it's just nice to look at. It is nice in terms of its presentation, and it's unique. Anyway, moving on to sound. The sound is of reasonable quality here, and really complements the gameplay and the rest of the presentation. Now, I go through a bunch of different procedures when I'm reviewing a game. I don't just play the game, I do specific tests. When it comes to detecting whether or not the sound is very good with the gameplay, one of the things I do is turn the sound off and try to play the game. Now, if I start struggling just enough without those audio cues, then I see the sound is doing its job when it comes to the gameplay. The sound cues aren't there, and I'm not reacting to it, and thus I'm having a little bit more trouble. Now, I have to be careful on this, however. If I'm too dependent on the sound, then the visual impact in terms of the combat and gameplay, it may not be there. If you're so focused on the audio and it's doing all the work, then you might as well be playing the game blind, and vice versa. So there is a sort of balance that's needed there, and Hollow Knight has that balance. It also fits the atmosphere it's going for most of the time. Things like this tunnel section. The sounds of huge drills burrowing through the ground tell you that, hey, something's moving around here, before you even see the giant worm things that are easily making their way through the tunnels. Again, the devil is always in the details, and it's little things like the clash of the swords between you and an enemy that's complemented with the right sound effects. Only on a rare occasion did I think something was missing sound-wise. But here, listen for yourself and see what I'm talking about. As to the music, expect a series of pieces highlighting the string instruments, along with the harp and the piano, that lightly complement the action tone the game is going for, and smoothing things down when things get a little less actiony. It's interesting though. I'd classify the pieces having a mysterious presence to them, highlighting the unknown and working towards the tones of the story. But I really couldn't tell you for the life of me why I think that. Maybe it's the way the crescendos work up to a point. Maybe it has to do with the space between certain notes at the start of some pieces. It definitely fits the tone of the game, and maybe it just reminds me of the X-Files a little bit. The music, however, is definitely meant to be complimentary, as while I like several of the pieces here, none of them stand out as music that I have to listen to over and over and over again. It's good programming music, to be honest. Something there to set the mood, to keep your mind at ease in the right rhythm. But it's nothing that makes me want to listen to it just to pay only attention to it. Take a listen though, and you'll hear what I'm talking about. Overall, the presentation may be the underrated star of this year when it comes to games. Sure, there are games with better graphics and maybe even better art styles, but I don't see a game that took its presentation and made it work so well with all the other elements here, especially within this genre. Once again, I give kudos to Team Cherry. Finally, let's briefly talk about the story. It's not the center point here by any stretch of the imagination, and it falls somewhere between the older and newer Metroidvanias when it comes to that. There's more story here than the old NES ones, and there's a variety of characters and lore to learn about this world. It's just that it doesn't ever get to the point where it's truly a major focus. It's just sort of in the background. Here's the basics. You're an unnamed knight that comes to a mysterious town, which is reasonably barren of life for some reason. There's no explanation for what the knight is doing here, and it's almost like he's being drawn by fate to a mysterious quest that he has no idea what it's about, which seems to be in an area under the town known as Hollow Nest. In that Hollow Nest, you run across a mysterious bug named Hornet, who seems to have some clue about your past, but seems to also consider you a threat. Now, after fighting with her, she sort of gets away, and you start to come across a little bit more information. There seems to be a seal that is seemingly holding back this great enemy known as the Hollow Knight, and there's an infection that has come across the land in Hollow Nest that seems to be related to that evil. So, as the great knight that you are, your job is to figure out how to get rid of the infection and save the Hollow Nest once and for all. Now, that may sound like your typical knight on a quest storyline, but Hollow Knight is sorta weird in its storytelling. The thing is, when it comes to the main plot, those details, at least in my mind, are sorta not necessarily clear from the get-go, even when it presents it to you. Yeah, there are a couple of main story segments that happen that try to give you a basic idea of that, but I'm gonna be honest here. I had no idea what the true story was going on for a good amount of the game. Hell, I didn't even know that the Hollow Knight was a bad guy for the majority of it. I thought I was the Hollow Knight until about halfway through the game. Now, this type of story presentation can work for a large audience as a mystery discovery type plot. But here's the thing with Hollow Knight. The lack of detail from the get-go and basic facts you can work with don't help establish that. You need more basics from the get-go to give the player something solid to work off of and let their imagination run in certain directions. Give too little, and their imagination is all over the place. And for the majority of the audience here, I see them ignoring the story, because, well, by the time it gets more direct, they've already tuned out. To me, only the hardcore loreists or detectives out there will really enjoy this plot in the way that it's presented. Most of the story comes from talking with the various members of the town that you run across in your journey, and you'll have to remember what they said, because putting the story together is like putting a puzzle together. To a certain extent, however, that does work. The thing is that the characters that you run across have some interesting quirks and personalities. They make you want to learn more about the characters and this world as a whole. Why is this bug so fascinated with this fake hero? What's the deal with this wandering bug? The game also uses the world itself, as it's very effective in environmental storytelling and secondary storytelling. For example, you'll come across a colony of mantises, and you'll realize that even before you face the boss in the area, that the way the colony is laid out tells you about these creatures. They're more civilized. They seem to have a lot more structure than the bugs that you have run across before. And the thing is, they seem to wait to attack you before you go at them yourself. The details in these kind of interactions with these creatures tell a story within itself, and that's actually rather impressive considering the focus on gameplay here. You'll wonder what killed all these supposed heroes, given what you had just gone through, and start to notice where exactly they are damaged if you look closely enough. There is a ton of detail here, and I have to commend the artists for really rewarding those who are paying attention, at least story-wise. Now, one other thing to note here. Story lovers need to beat the game with its true ending to really get a lot of value out of this game. It's not that the other endings are necessarily bad, but the extra information you'll get in the real ending really helps take the story and lore to something that is, in my mind, a bit more enjoyable. Normally, I talk a little bit more about the story, even in games where the story is secondary like it is in Hollow Knight. But here's the thing, the gameplay was so polished, and the presentation was so polished that even though the story was decent in certain areas and was enjoyable in certain areas, it just sort of paled in comparison to those two. It's not bad, it's just the fact that the other two parts were so fantastic. In the end, Hollow Knight is one of the indie stars of this year. It stuck to the basics of the Metroidvania genre, but it polished those basics to a shine that would make the sun blush. The game's unique presentation highlights a battle system that focuses on spacing and precision, and brings back some feelings of some of the best games in the genre, Castlevania in particular. With the game's challenge curve ramping up appropriately, the battles being exciting but winnable, and the game keeping enough story to keep it all together, this is one great package to get. And if I haven't made it perfectly clear up to this point, Hollow Knight is a must-buy, coming in at a 92 on my scoring scale. That's a day one buy, in case you were wondering. But like always, that doesn't take into account my enhancer system. Basically, there's too many types of games and preferences out there when it comes for gaming, and I try to match the game's strengths with your particular tastes. I do that by using score enhancers. So, if you fall strongly into one of these categories on the screen, then add or subtract the score to the base score of the game. If the first digit of your score changes, then refer to my scoring guide in the description below to find out where the game falls in particular with you. And that's it for this review. Coming up on the channel will be a Sonic Mania review, as well as a mini Ghost critical eye, sort of critical eye, not really. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do with that. Maybe it'll be a Let's Play or my Flyby series, but we'll see. I am working on some game design videos in the background, but honestly, I'm also working on a huge article when it comes to TechRaptor and the whole YouTube situation. So keep an eye out for TechRaptor in terms of some of my work. For those who have made it this far in the review, I only have one thing to ask of you. Leave a comment in the comment section below of how you think I can improve these reviews, whether it be the way I write, whether it be the format, whatever. I'll never be a reviewer like Total Biscuit. I will never be a reviewer like VG Donkey. I don't necessarily have that voice, and I don't necessarily have the comedy aspect of my presentation down. But I do think I add something in terms of the review community, in terms of detail, and in terms of giving you everything you need to know about a game. But there's ways that I could improve, and sometimes I can't see them. So if you can, let me know in the comment section below. Anyway, I will see you all later. And as always, keep on gaming.